on earth is this?
Hello, and welcome to this mildly sunny morning in southern Berlin, and more specifically the Tempelhof district. Famed for not much, the neighborhood was once home to one of Europe's largest and most important airports, which shut down in 2008, also bringing to a sad end the world's smallest duty-free shop. Shame. But at least they now have one of the world's largest urban parks, so swings and roundabouts. Other than that, Tempelhof nowadays is part industrial, part residential. Berlin's famously raucous nightlife seems to have mostly skipped over this district, and you'll scarcely see any tourists here, which is probably why they've managed to get away with having this thing in the middle of their neighborhood for 80 years, despite it being about as sightly as, well, a massive lump of concrete with no discernible purpose. Is it a silo, a factory, a warehouse, or none of the above? The story behind this bizarre structure is one of misguided ambition, failed experimentation, and one of the darkest chapters in human history. This is the story of the heavy load-bearing body. It's a great name, right? As we all know, Germans love a compound word that smashes multiple concepts into one, with the English translation often emerging as a rather unromantic mess. So this, in English, is the heavy load-bearing body. But in German, it's the Schwerbelastungskörper, or more locally, the Großbelastungskörper, or even more locally, the Nazi block. Oh dear, this is going to take some explaining, isn't it? The year is 1941. I mean, not now, but go with me. World War II is in full swing. The Nazis have made worryingly rapid progress across Europe, with France having just followed Poland, Czechoslovakia, and a handful of other nations in falling into Adolf Hitler's hands. And with the brief respite that came after the fall of France, came the resurrection of an idea. Prior to the war, Hitler had envisioned that, once he had brought the globe under Nazi control, this enormous global empire would need a fitting capital city. And in its form at the time, Berlin simply wouldn't do. It was too organically laid out, with winding streets, ancient districts, and nowhere near enough terrifying 300-foot buildings and monuments that would have made Pyongyang look like a model village. Enter Albert Speer, one of Hitler's closest allies and a highly ambitious architect and later Minister for Armament, who was tasked with planning what would become known as Welthaupstadt Germania, or World Capital Germania, or just Germania for short. This behemoth of a new capital city would be the epicenter of the so-called Thousand-Year Reich, and would be part megacity, part living museum, replete with some of the largest architectural projects ever envisaged to represent the might of Nazi Germany. Indeed, Hitler told Speer that it was one of the country's most important unfinished tasks, which at that time included the upcoming invasion of the Soviet Union, and was convinced that Germania would be completed by the year 1950, rivaling the pyramids of Egypt and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon in size and stature.
And here it is. Wait. This was supposed to be a megacity, the likes of which the world had never seen before. How did years of planning, with much of it coming directly from Hitler himself, culminate in a 12,000-ton concrete blob that has no discernible purpose?
Remember earlier that I said that this was a rather quiet corner of Berlin? Well, that's the thing. This part of Berlin would not have been so sleepy had Albert Speer had his way. Hitler bestowed extraordinary powers onto him that effectively allowed him to bypass any oversight from local lawmakers, and this is not entirely surprising. Speer's plans involved the complete destruction of huge swathes of central Berlin, and the new city that would be built on top to take its place was to feature the world's largest building, known as the Volkshalle, or People's Hall, a 4 million square foot plaza, and it would all be centered around two gargantuan perpendicular boulevards imaginatively known as the north-south axis and the east-west axis. And that naming system is about the only part of this story that lives up to the stereotype of German efficiency. The Volkshalle would sit near the nexus of the two enormous roads, and at the southern end of the north-south axis would be Hitler's pièce de résistance, the Triumphbogen, or Arch of Triumph, a gigantic arch that could fit the entire Parisian Arc de Triomphe, on which it was based, under one of its entryways. This thing was due to be 100 meters, or 330 feet tall, more than double the height of its French counterpart, and as a result, it would have been extraordinarily heavy. So Speer and Hitler came up with an idea. They were aware, as people had been for centuries, that Berlin had been built on what is effectively a swamp, made relatively unstable by watery soil and glacial sands, but where dictators with a more grounded grip on reality would perhaps have made a new planned city elsewhere, scaled down their plans considerably, or scrapped them altogether, Hitler was determined to press on, asking Speer to test whether or not the ground near the planned arch would be stable enough to hold the structure, and Speer took this to mean, build an enormously heavy block of concrete and see what happens. And so the heavy load-bearing body, a 12,000-ton block of building material, was born and plopped down here in Tempelhof. Speer and his collaborators had decided that 6 centimeters would be the maximum permissible depth to which the block could sink, determining that this level of subsidence would be minimal enough to support the Arch of Triumph. But slowly, over the course of a few months between 1941 and 1942, this thing ended up sinking 18 centimeters into the terrain, starkly demonstrating to everyone that Speer's plans could and would never come to fruition. Who would have thought, when faced with the material might of the Western Allies and the incalculable manpower of the Soviet Union to the east, that a bit of mushy soil would spell the end of the great Welthaupstadt Germania? So with this big concrete nightmare having firmly poured water on Hitler's little urban planning adventure, the Führer's attentions were, understandably, turned elsewhere, and months later he launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history, in an ultimately doomed attempt to take down Stalin and the Soviet Union. He really was angry about Berlin's soil, wasn't he? With the series of events that led to Germany's eventual defeat now in full swing, no plans were made to resurrect Germania, and Berlin soon looked like this, while Hitler looked very much dead, and the dream of Germania died with him.
But considering the efforts that the Soviets and the Western Allies went to after the war to denazify Germany by removing any tangible evidence of its existence, how did this thing survive?
Well, for a start, it's such a unique structure that engineers felt that they could make use of its unusual properties and continue to use it as a test site until 1983. It was then entered into the list of historical buildings in 1995, despite not really being a building, and taken under the local authorities' control in 2002. And since then, it's hosted everything from cafes to climbing walls and guided tours operated by the city. While many people wanted this thing gone after the war, a mixture of 2 things have saved it from destruction. One is that it has 2 important train lines running right next to it, and according to local authorities, demolishing a structure of this size and density would potentially force the closure of both of these lines, disrupting residential areas nearby. It's just that unwieldy. The other is that, realistically, not many people care about this thing being here. It's hidden behind some trees in a little visited area of the city, and doesn't exactly serve as a great veneration of Nazi ideology. If anything, it's a tangible leftover of Hitler's hubris and, to an extent, idiocy. The sheer scale of Germania made it a fairly unrealistic vanity project from the get-go, not to mention the fact that he attempted to start construction on it while fighting a world war on multiple different fronts. The idea was doomed from the start, and now one of the only physical remnants of Hitler's grand world capital left is this goofy, embarrassing, failed experiment. To me, it's rather fitting.
So this, in English, is the heavy load-bearing body, but in German, it's the Schwerbelastungskörper, or more locally, the Großbelastung. What the fuck? How am I going to do this? So this, in English, is the heavy load-bearing body, but in German, fucking hell. So this, in English, I can't fucking do this now.